In the name of the one who loves the beloved and love itself. Amen. Please be seated. Gosh, that was a cheerful gospel. Sundays like this, I think I should have looked more carefully at the rota and given it to somebody else. But here we go. I actually think this is a great gospel. I think it's one of those ones where Jesus is naming something that we might otherwise miss, speaking the truth about something. But let me start somewhere else for a second. Have you ever been to Thanksgiving dinner after a particularly contentious general election has just come to a conclusion and found yourself in an argument over the dinner table? Anybody? Or just general Thanksgiving tension in itself? Yes. We're a big country and we all move around a lot. So lots of people move to parts of the country they feel comfortable with, that fit their political views. That's great. And then generations often have different views. And at Thanksgiving, we bring people all back from all the farthest corners of the country to one table, uncles, aunts, mums, dads, children, nieces, nephews, and intergenerations mix. And inevitably, if there has been a contentious general election, which we seem to have had more of recently, an argument can often break out. Yes? Thank God for turkey. And the tryptophan in the turkey that makes everybody fall asleep by the end of the dinner, because it can kind of lower the tension in the room. Yes? When we think of that environment, father arguing with daughter, daughter or son with mother, father-in-law with son-in-law, sounds an awful lot like what Jesus is describing in the gospel today. And so therefore, he might just be naming the fact that conflict exists. It's a thing. And we should contemplate it. There are three ways, I think, of dealing with the tension at the Thanksgiving dinner. One is to completely deny it exists and ignore it, bury it, keep it down, keep it deep. And some of us try and do that to varying degrees of success. But if you do that too much, it can fester under the surface. The other is to let it all out. Have the fight. Have it. Just argue with everybody and blow up and see where that goes. And some families can repair things after that, but some less so. Some can have generational problems then over a long period of time with conflict. I do think there are ways of naming our differences respectfully from a place of deeply held values. That's what I like to try and lean into. To try and name what it is that you disagree about, but to try and go deeper and find on the foundation upon which your values are based, and then have a meaningful conversation if you can possibly do that. Okay, I'm going to leave Thanksgiving aside now, though, and say that Jesus in this gospel is talking about conflict. And I want to give a very brief history of the period of time in which Matthew is writing in order for you to understand why this comes up in the text. So Jesus was around the first 3 decades of the Common Era, and he was teaching around the 30s. And I believe that he said many of these things that exist in the gospel, but they were all written down years later in a different context. They were written down and composed by the gospel writers for a different audience, where they were remembering what Jesus said, but sometimes shaping it for the time. So by the time Matthew was writing in the 70s, possibly, maybe a little after, the temple had been destroyed, Jerusalem has been sacked, and the whole culture had changed. There was conflict in the air, and the Christians were feeling it, and it pops up in Matthew's Gospels. Let me try and describe very briefly why that happened. It seems that the Roman Empire had one policy for dealing with its vassal states. They tried to manage them by giving them space to practice their religions freely and openly. And they thought that that would help to keep the peace in the states that they were occupying. So much so that they even made sure that the king that they had planted in Israel, which was kind of a fake King Herod, had the money to build the temple. And so it was built, and Jewish religion could be practiced in Israel, and that was their policy for managing their vassal states. And then they discovered that that seemed to generate resentment. That the people who were practicing the religion locally, not just in Jerusalem, but around the empire, could rise up and want to fight their Roman overlords because they spent time in their religion realizing that they had independence and they wanted to claim it. So they changed their policy. They changed their policy and decided to try and destroy the cultures that they were occupying. And that happened in Jerusalem. They went in and they tore down the temple that Herod had built. They erected monuments to Roman gods in Jerusalem, and they tried to suppress religions that did not comport with the Roman state religion. And that created the environment that Matthew was writing in. Now, before the 70s, you could be Jewish and Christian. You had some slightly different convictions. You might go to the temple, go to the synagogue, go and celebrate with Christians and interchange between the two. That was possible. Peter and Paul had an argument at one point about whether you had to become Jewish before you could become Christian, and Paul won that argument so Gentiles could become Christians without first becoming Jewish. So there was some cultural separation that was beginning. But in the environment of violence that was created by the Roman Empire in around the 70s, people retracted into their core identity. So the generosity that had perhaps existed between different people was broken. So the Jewish identity asserted itself, and this strange sect of Christianity was rejected, pushed out of the Jewish cult. And there was tension. Imagine if you're in one family and parents were still holding on to their original Jewish faith, but the children had accepted the idea of Jesus as the Messiah. How would their festival meals feel if they were trying to discuss religion at the dining table? Or what about if a brother and sister had gone in different directions in relation to their faith? It created all kinds of tension. And so when we come to this gospel, Jesus is acknowledging that, and Matthew is constructing a story that just tells the truth about what people are experiencing. At first, Jesus says, the servants aren't greater than the master, and if they treat the master like this, how are they going to treat his followers? He's talking about himself because the disciples are aware that they are getting badly treated. So if they call me Beelzebub as your master, as your teacher, what are they going to call you? They're going to call you insulting things as well. So just get used to that. But, he says, don't let the things I've taught you, don't let your journey in faith be unseated by that from your lives. Remember to follow me. Remember all the things I've taught you. Remember what's gone on in your hearts. Remember the transformation you've experienced because it's given you life, and don't let go of it even under that kind of pressure. Then he comes to say, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword, which if torn out of context sounds really strange, but if we look at it as though he's just telling the truth, that people aren't always going to agree. That this new Christian conviction is different and new, and it's going to cause some family arguments, then the next passage makes sense. You're going to find that parents aren't going to agree with their children. Children aren't going to agree with their parents. Brothers and sisters are going to go in different directions. And still, hold on to these convictions. Jesus is just telling the truth about the environment that they are in. And we're in an environment that's full of conflict. We have had more brutal general election campaigns recently, and we find ourselves more polarized. What I see in this text is an invitation to contemplate our faith, our values, What do we really believe? To recognize that sometimes we're having fights about ridiculous things and to let them go. But to recognize that sometimes we're having disagreements about things which are of fundamental value. And that's where we need to try and go to in order to have the meaningful conversation. Sometimes we would disagree with people. But the question is, do we have those kinds of values embedded in our hearts? I'm really asking you. Do you have those kinds of values really deeply embedded in your hearts? As people of faith, as followers of Jesus, as Episcopalians who believe in justice for all, who believe in seeing Christ in the face of everybody around us, are they that well embedded that you couldn't possibly let them be shaken? As Episcopalians, we can often be super polite. We can be nice. We can just let things go. But increasingly, I'm finding myself wanting to say with joy, with energy, this is what I think. And having that conversation with people who are Christian, people from other faiths, people who aren't Christian, and finding that that conversation can happen in a meaningful way based on the values I think are really important. I wonder if you've had conversations like that. At the earlier service, I wasn't quite sure how to end my sermon, and I wanted to tidy it up and go to a kind of a non-conflict end of the sermon. But I'm going to leave that for now and just say that's not what Jesus does in this text. He does encourage people to be really, really convinced of their faith and to really share. Don't pick fights for the sake of it, but to really share what they believe. So as I come to an end now, I actually want to take us to one of the other texts, which I had forgotten about earlier on today, but it's beautiful. In the prophecy of Jeremiah, he comes to this moment where he said, I was getting into conflict with people because I was sharing what I really thought. And I tried to not say anything. I tried to keep quiet. And here's the line that I love. Then within me there is something like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I'm weary with holding it in, and I cannot. He said he tried to keep quiet about what he really believed. And it became like a fire burning inside him until he couldn't stay quiet anymore. I invite you to look for that kind of faith and those kinds of values in your lives so that you can't hold it inside. But even if it causes some conflict, you can speak about the things you believe to be really true. Amen.